Hi everyone, good morning and apologies for the delay. We had some technical glitches. I'm Arunima, I'm the research manager at the Class Foundation. We are very excited to welcome you for our second online student living forum of this year. We will be looking into the Nordic region this year, and we have Sam Bailey-Watts, who would be the moderator of this forum. Very quickly, I will just run through the agenda. We will start with a quick fact sheet, which I will present just to set the scene, to tell you a little bit about the higher education sector, the housing trends, and student well-being aspects in the Nordics. And then we will move on to a really interesting data insight by Stuart from Knight Frank. And then we will have a panel discussion. We will save the questions till the end for Stuart and the panelists, but feel free to type them, what you think of, whatever comes to your mind, in the chat, and we will pick them up towards the end of the session. Sam, great. Would you like to take over?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for your patience there. We had a little technical glitch, so apologies for that. And welcome and good afternoon. Thank you, Arunima, for picking up there. We're delighted to open the 2024 Regional Student Living event in the Nordics. Our session today, and forgive me if I'm repeating what Arunima has just said, includes a brief update from Arunima on who is the class's research manager, who will then hand over to Stuart Osborne, the head of European living sectors from our partners at Knight Frank. I will then moderate a panel discussion with 4 representatives from the student housing sector in the Nordics. We will discuss the perspectives from each panelist and consider why we are experiencing a lack of housing development despite increasing demand, and the challenge of student housing affordability and how these issues could be tackled as we move through the 2024 and beyond. So thank you very much, everybody. Do appreciate your attendance today. What's incredibly important to the class is our community and how we interact with each other across countries and across the continent. So it's really important that we get questions today. Any questions that we can't answer during this session, we will pick up and respond afterwards. I think it's really important that we keep the communication coming, and just keep an eye out for our class conference in Manchester this year. We really like as many attendees as we can from each region, so it's really important for us to keep on reiterating that. And I'm going to hand over to Arunima, who's going to give an update on the Nordics from her fact sheet. So Arunima, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam. Great. Can we have the first slide, Louise? Thank you. So, of course, starting off with the higher education sector in the Nordics, I have some quick facts to go through. It's very interesting to know that the Nordics actually have 2 out of the 5 highest enrollment rates in the OECD countries, which is Finland and Sweden. And among the Nordic countries, Sweden is sort of leading the way in terms of it being the highest growing international student sector. And this is largely because there are easy access to loans and grants, and also with the higher number of English taught courses. In terms of the city, Copenhagen is the biggest hub for international students, with 23% of them residing in the city, and with the overall number of nearly 115,000, it also is just generally the largest city in the Nordics. We have actually sent this fact sheet out to you through an email. So I'm just going to skip a few things. Louise, can we go on to the next slide, please? Now moving on to student housing in the Nordics, is just why we're all here. There are just 2 key trends that I want to draw your attention to. The first one being that the market, which has traditionally been a social model, has sort of shifted a lot in terms of just the way it operates because of coming of private investors and operators. We see that the rental models have changed, and there has been a lot of volatility in pricing. And we also see shorter tenancy cycles, which means that operators have to remarket their units more frequently, and with like large portfolio acquisitions with the likes of Heimstaden, Zior, and Catella, we see a rapid shift and concentration within a given city. However, all of that given, there is still this big question of affordability, and there's a gap in terms of affordable housing. And we see this as a good opportunity, a great opportunity for both private and public or social sector alike to meet this need. Then the other aspect which came up in the recent NSBO conference, which I'm sure many of you have attended, looks at how is the fact that how there has been, due to rising costs, due to shortage of labor, and due to global inflation, we see a lot of constructions not happening. There are subsidies present in most of the Nordic countries, but those are not really enough to meet the costs which have gone up. And of course, there's the question of land, or like land in a desirable place to build. Now moving on to the well-being aspect of our students in the Nordics. Louise, can we have the next slide? Thank you. This is data from our European Student Living Monitor from 2023, which was our pilot European research. We actually had more than 500 responses from Denmark. This was the largest responses from a country we had last year. You see that what is exactly an MHI-5 score? It basically a measure of way of calculating what is the happiness level or well-being level of an individual. Anything over 60 is considered good mental health. So as you can see, the European average is actually isn't considered as good mental health. We have data from Denmark, Finland, and Iceland. Denmark is almost close to 60, so that's great. Finland and Iceland are quite behind, and we also see that, and unfortunately, we did not have enough data to make any conclusive remarks for Sweden and Norway. Just two quick aspects I want to point out is that if students do not get their first choice of accommodation, their mental health does suffer. And the two reasons why they don't get their access to their first choice of accommodation is either it is just not available, that's 43% of the students, or it's just too expensive for them that they can't afford it, and that's 34% of the students. And for those who can't afford it, their MHI-5 score actually falls to 47, which is quite alarming. Then there are, of course, some amenities and services which do have a good impact on students. So these are generally spaces like outdoor spaces, gyms, recreational areas, community areas, which students do really appreciate, and also support in terms of community-led programs and also organized community. The last thing I want to end on is that around 75% of the students in the Nordic do not have access or not know where to reach out to when it comes to mental health support, and around 80% do not have access to any kind of job counseling. According to our research, we find these two areas extremely crucial for students. So this might be something we can work together as a community. Thank you. And now I would like to invite Stuart Osborne from Knight Frank to give the data insight. Over to you, Stuart. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Rinima. Can you see my screen? Fantastic. Yeah. That's a good start. Thanks very much for that. And I think really useful to kind of see the kind of the bits behind the data that I'm going to be presenting. So we've got a kind of a two-phase approach on this one. So first of all, we're just going to talk a bit around the kind of the wider market and what's going on, and then a bit more about the Nordics in specific. Trying to get all that into 10 minutes is hopefully we'll do all right. But as I'm sure everyone is very aware at the moment, I mean, we have seen quite a significant difficulty, should we say, in the investment markets over the last couple of years. But just talking a bit around the kind of the volatility and what we're seeing. So I mean, in most large economies, we've got much clearer signals that inflation is falling, unemployment remains low, and economic growth is continuing, and also it hasn't stalled completely. I mean, stress levels have eased slightly as financial markets have recovered from the disruption caused by the war in Ukraine and uncertainty in the strength of the US banking system. But the conflict in the Middle East at the moment it still hasn't shown signs of spilling over to the extent in which it's causing any significant systemic stress, which we ultimately hope will get better quickly and shortly. Just following on from that, so we produce a capital gravity model, which really looks at some of the key drivers of capital globally. And our latest model points to an uplift in cross-border capital this year. And from there, we expect momentum to build into 25 and 26. So definitely cause for optimism, which ultimately is supported by lower costs of debt, but also wider wealth creation, which is a key story that we see in that wealth piece. And as you'll see on the slide here, for the Nordics, we're forecasting a massive uplift in cross-border capital flows of 200% plus. Which is significant when you compare it to the likes of the UK or other European countries, such as Spain, for example, and particularly in the living sectors. Now, in terms of investment volumes across Europe, so just to put some numbers on this, in 2022, we saw it was around 15.4 billion euros transact, and then last year in 2023, as expected, a significant dip where it was just under 5 billion, which represents a 68% fall in investment volumes year on year. I mean, having said that, when we see spikes like 2022, obviously there's always a few questions around what the kind of the significant changes there. I mean, in 2022, we saw the student roost portfolio in the UK, which was over 3 billion euros. And if you strip that out, it basically took the whole year in the UK alone to reach their record of 8.1 billion if you strip that out. So whilst it's a peak, I think, you know, we've seen investment volumes impacted. The long-term average investment across Europe is about 7.8 billion euros. So 4.8 billion last year, which is somewhere below the long-term average as expected. But the first quarter and year to date for 24 has been pretty slow. But it's definitely likely to be stronger globally and on a European basis. And the data already shows a 17.5% uplift on year on year based on the year quarter one that we've seen so far. Just going back to those cross-border capital flows, and I mean, I guess these graphs show it for a bit more dramatically. But I mean, one of the key reasons we've seen investment fall away is down to that contraction of cross-border investment. And student property will continue to be highly sought after when confidence returns. And I think it will be one of the first sectors that we see kind of deal volume significantly increase. So despite the slowdown last year, I think, you know, as a globally traded asset class, it's definitely going to significantly pick back up. But there's still significant barriers to entry, and whilst we expect it to pick back up, there's still a significant proportion of investors who are really keen to invest in PBSA and living sectors in general. But the opportunities are still hard to find, with many large players aggregating portfolios. And as such, we see fewer individual asset trades, which creates greater competition around the more institutional single asset opportunities. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Focusing a bit more on the Nordics now, and just following on from those volume themes. I mean, this, as you can see, it represents a pretty similar theme to total investment volumes for PBSA in Europe. So in 2022, we saw about a $250 million traded, which in 2023 was just over 300 million, which reflects a drop of 75% year on year. So relatively equivalent. The long-term average for the Nordics is about 415 million euros. So we aren't significantly off the pace. But I mean, as we've said, whilst investment has been restricted generally since the outbreak of the war in the Ukraine, the Nordics has showed some record numbers with 500% growth in investment over the 3-year period to 2022's record-breaking year. So we have been seeing some really strong numbers around the Nordics in particular. Over the last year or so, some of the kind of the notable PBSA transactions across the Nordics. We've got BlackRock's acquisition of Signature Bayern, and WT's acquisition of the SBS portfolio, and Sam Pension's acquisition of the Ungbo portfolio. So there are some proper trades happening in addition to the smaller trades that we see which bulk out those volumes. Now, I guess just looking at pricing, and again, just stepping back a bit on a European level, I mean, it's easy to get caught up in where pricing is at today, and we've all been trying to do that for the last kind of 12, 18 months. But the long-term yield trend for PBSA, as we can see here, and we see yield soften and harden throughout various cycles. The long-term trend has continued as the fundamentals of the sectors remain robust and demand from investors continue. So looking at the current economics, it's hard to see where and when pricing will head to. But as the anticipated rate cuts take hold, we see debt costs lower, we expect yield compression to return in the long term. But before anyone gets too worried, just on the numbers here, these yields are average yields across the market, so they're not reflecting kind of prime yields before anyone gets a bit too scared. The numbers are a bit higher. But PBSA also just looks really good value compared to PBS compared to multifamily. So on average we're looking at about a 200 basis points yield delta between the two, which you compare that to the UK, it's 63 basis points, and I think when we're talking about prime yields, it's probably closer to 100 basis points in terms of delta. But it still looks like really good value, and particularly for the Nordics and Europe and the rest of Europe alike, when we're talking about kind of residential and commercial zoning, the actual restriction on the residential zoning is a lot looser. So the ability to operate as a backup for residential is still really attractive. So seeing those yield deltas is really quite interesting. And this graph, and I guess it's equally relevant when we're talking about the Nordics, is just around the kind of the tier 1 and tier 2 cities. So it's basically a flight to quality and the difference between median versus lower quartile spread. So whilst this graph reflects the US, I think it's something that we see happening elsewhere as well, where during the pandemic, we saw investors and lending become increasingly sensitive to pre-leasing performance, particularly for international investors, having cities and locations which are well known to investors is kind of the crux of investing in. So we've seen that flight to quality. And I think we'll see a bit more of a divergence between tier 1 and tier 2 markets. But fundamentally, having said that, I think in Europe, a lot of that is still driven by where we see really strong university cities. So the equivalent of the difference between Malmö and Lund, for example, in Sweden. A fantastic university at Lund, but I think Malmö takes up quite a significant proportion of student accommodation and students who do actually travel between the two as well. So as I say, whilst the graph shows the spread between the medium and top quartile yields, and really reflects the kind of emerging polarization between prime assets, I think in this uncertain stage we're going to see that continue. And just touching on student numbers then across the Nordics. So as you can see, we've got close to 1 million full-time students across the Nordics. We've seen really strong growth in the last couple of years. I mean, pre-2020, pre-2019, so pre-COVID, we saw a relatively stable growth profile. But we've seen a really significant uptick since COVID of 8% since 2019, which, as we'll come on to, is largely driven by an increase in domestic students as well. And I think particularly as we see rising costs, as Arunima touched on beforehand, the availability of stipends for students, which allows them to basically kind of study in country at much lower cost compared to if they were going to travel abroad, seems to have really been taking hold. But really strong numbers. And then when we look at internationals, they probably haven't grown as much in the same period across the Nordics. Which is actually a really interesting theme that we've seen, and there's been really steady growth, except as you can see for Denmark there. I mean, just looking at some of the key numbers there, so we've seen a 17.5% increase in international students, which now reflect about just over 7% of the full-time population. and just over 100,000 students. So whilst since 2013, I guess it's been a pretty mixed story. I think the interesting thing, and we touched on it yesterday, and also at the start of this, is going to be around affordability as well for those domestic students. So that's going to be an interesting evolution. And then just looking how those numbers play out across the cities themselves. So here, as I say, there's a continuing theme when we talk about Denmark and the impacts that's having. So you can see here student numbers in total for Copenhagen and Aarhus have stayed kind of relatively stable, and fundamentally we've seen stronger growth in other markets like Stockholm, Oslo, Helsinki. I mean, in terms of just putting some numbers on those, so Stockholm, we've seen 12% of growth in student numbers, so really significant growth there. Aarhus and Oslo around 3%, but interestingly, as I say, it's probably that story around Denmark. And then again, the theme kind of continues around. So in terms of supply, Copenhagen, Helsinki, Aarhus demonstrating much higher level of supply than Stockholm and Oslo. Again, I think it's worthwhile when we look at these numbers, and particularly those numbers in the 20s, it's quite interesting looking at what the type of supply is. So it's not all kind of new shiny institutional product. There is a lot of more affordable accommodation in there as well. So I think it always needs to be taken into account whenever people start to kind of get concerned about either saturation or levels of provision like this. It's quite a spread in terms of the type of accommodation that's being provided. But ultimately, I think when you look at Stockholm and you look at the growth of the numbers that have happened there, and you look at the level of supply, clearly not a huge amount is still being delivered at the moment. So there's still quite a significant undersupply. And then just looking at the average price per month, again, following from the story of Denmark, so Copenhagen, and it's worthwhile pointing out these are kind of institutional grade average PBSA numbers. So over €1,000 in Copenhagen compared to under 1,000, and even in Stockholm, looking at an average of just under €500. Some of that obviously has to do with how the rental regulations and norm rents and negotiation of rents with tenant bodies take place in markets like Sweden. However, when you're looking at student choices, particularly at the moment in an environment where the cost of living is taken into account significantly by students, I think numbers like these become quite critical. That's pretty much it from me. So I'll hand back to the class guys. But thanks very much indeed for listening, and happy to answer any questions at the end.
Stuart, thank you very much for that. That was a fantastic summary of where we are in terms of the Nordics, and I'm sure there'll be some questions. There's a couple come up already, and just to remind all attendees, you can see at the bottom of your screen a chat section and a Q&A section. Pop your questions in the Q&A section, because that will allow us to get through as many as we possibly can during the session. Stuart, there's a couple for you there from some excited attendees, so if you can look at them, that would be fantastic. But we're now going to move on to the panel discussion, and I'm delighted to invite our 4 panelists. First of all, to introduce ourselves, we've picked up 3 main threads and themes for the discussion today. But in the first instance, it would be great for each of the panelists just to introduce themselves, starting with Laurie, who appears first on my screen on the panel.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lauri Lehtoruusu. I'm the Executive Director for SOA, which is the Finnish National Organization for Student Housing Providers. So overall, our non-profit members own roughly 45,000 apartments and cater to roughly 70,000 students, which makes up pretty much most of the Finnish student housing sector entirely.
Thank you, Laurie. Ben?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me on the panel today. So my name is Ben, and I work for NIDO. And NIDO is a European student platform that works with investors and operates currently 7,000 beds across Europe, with another 3,000 beds in the pipeline and development. My role within NIDO is I operate and manage the residence teams in Ireland and Denmark, so responsible for all property management.
Thank you very much, Ben. Christina.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Christina Olsen, CEO of SIA, one of the new market entry into the Nordic. We bought, like as some of you might know, the Basecamp portfolio 2 years ago. I'm basically leading everything that is under operation. So we have around 25,000 beds right now across Europe, 42 cities. So I'm sitting here in Belgium and happy to join you.
Thank you, Christina. Lovely to see you. And I'm sorry, I keep on getting my pronunciations right, but Teresa.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Therese, and I'm a student housing advisor at Malmö University. So we're a public university way down south in Sweden. We have about 25,000 students. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks. That's a wonderful panel. I hope you'd all agree. So we're really delighted to have them all. And we're going to start off with a number of, we've got 3 questions, and we're going to go through. The first question is for all panelists, and then we'll move on and try and separate it out. We're going to try and finish around 10:02 to then pick up some questions. So keep those questions coming so we can try and pick them up at the end. So the first one is around much of Stuart's presentation is around the demand across the region, and what's been picked up in other forums around the Nordics is the lack of supply, the lack of development. But that whole demand-supply characteristics in each region become more and more critical as we move forward with this ever-growing need and ever-growing student population, not just through Europe, but globally. But I'd like to just hear the perspectives of each of our panelists around that in their specific areas and their thoughts on it. And I'm going to start with Laurie again, if I may, to give your thoughts, particularly on the Finnish position.
Well, the downturn in construction and the real estate sector, I think it applies to not only PBSA, but the sector in general. Like interest rates have gone up faster than rents, and the construction costs have gone up. So the business case is far more difficult than before. The demand is there. And in Finland in particular, I think we're seeing an increase in demand due to cuts to students' welfare benefits. But that demand is for the most affordable segment within the student housing sector. So we do see a lot of projects underway by non-profit student housing operators at the moment, still commencing new projects this year. However, the future looks quite grim. There's cuts to supply subsidies upcoming next year, which means that the funding is less available. It's more difficult to start off new projects. But as almost all the students in the Nordics live outside their parental home, I think we have to look at the sector, like student housing sector, compared to the situation of the general rental market. And it has a huge impact on what's the situations, because it's not against student housing versus living in their parental home. It's against student housing. It's like student housing or living in the general rental market. And in Finland, at least, we've seen over the past decade or so a huge construction boom, and it's mostly been small studio apartments in central locations, largely catering to the student sector as well. So they're not student housing, but catering to the student demand as well. But now, due to the cuts in students' welfare benefits, students are finding it harder to afford the rent levels that are in those apartments. So that's why the increasing demand is in the non-profit sector, like the most affordable options. Even though, like in general, there is an increase in demand, but part of it is catered by the general rental market that has had a huge boom over the past decade or so.
Thanks, Laurie. Christina, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, demand in general for student housing in Europe is really, really high. I mean, we have cities that are already full for next academic year, and the ramp up is really going quickly. It keeps on overperforming. So nothing wrong with demand in general, I have to say. But of course, there are also differences across Europe. And if I then speak a little bit more detail about the Nordic, then if we look at Copenhagen, then this is also really a market where we fill up like with, I mean, a speed that is nearly not seen anywhere, even though that this is also the area where we have the highest prices. It's a lot of international students for Copenhagen, I will say 85%. So the domestics, I mean, probably they go to, yeah, several of them, we also see that they stay home because the travel distance from where they're living into Copenhagen might not be that difficult for them. And I mean, else they find other supply than ours. So it's really targeted towards the international when we talk about the base camp portfolio, not the SEER portfolio as so. But if we look then a little to Aarhus, then it's a different situation. I mean, we also saw that the supply rate in Aarhus is rather high, 26%. And I mean, it's not going that quickly, to be honest. We do ramp up. We have a brand new property there that opened here in January. We see some nice numbers, but the speed is not at all comparable to Copenhagen. Malmö also went rather well when we opened last year, a brand new one as well. Kind of a release, I would say, because there are not that many private providers like us in Malmö, and we had a little different price setting, not following 100% the five-sector way that or five-factor way that you normally do in Sweden. So we were really happy to see the interest for this brand new PBSA product. So yeah, confirm demand is really high.
Good, brilliant. We're going to move to Therese now. Could you give us your thoughts on this?
Well, yes. So I would say since the 70s, there has been a shortage of student housing in Sweden. But in my opinion, this is beginning to change all over the country, with some regional exceptions like Stockholm, for example, because the Stockholm housing market is absolutely crazy. There seems to be no end for the need. But if you look at Malmö, for example, we have 5 student housing providers, and 3 of those have had an occupancy rate of less than 75% for this academic year. And I would say that is quite unusual, but we can also see that this is an ongoing trend, and a trend that we can see in other university cities as well. So I would say that perhaps in Sweden, the picture is changing a bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And Ben, over to you from a Nido perspective in Copenhagen.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that the Nordics are a strong investment market for real estate, and there's a strong demand for PBSA. I suppose looking at it from an operator's perspective and thinking about maybe why there's a lack of development, I suppose maybe 2 points that kind of, I guess, reach out to me maybe are developers are looking to create value-led opportunities, and they're looking to partner with operators that have the expertise, skill set, knowledge to enter the market and support them with that. And I don't see a dearth of those operators in the market. I feel like the Nordics as a whole and as a region have quite a high, I suppose, priority on well-being and sustainability, which are 2 of our kind of fundamental pillars as a business. And it's really important for students when they're picking, a high quality accommodation, that those attributes are delivered also. And there's not necessarily the operators out there that maybe incorporate that totally within their model. And another factor, I suppose, from a development perspective, is there is a rent cap in Denmark, so the returns can be relatively well, not relatively low, but I suppose investors are looking for a resilient kind of operating model that promotes kind of everything that they're trying to achieve for all stakeholders. And when looking at kind of the underwriting process for an asset, and you look at 3 to 5% rental increases per year with the rent cap that's in place, and in Copenhagen, for instance, it's not necessarily able to achieve that, but there is great value in partnering with an operator with the skill set and expertise to drive that kind of long-term value for the investors. So I think those are kind of my 2 points around maybe the lack of development that we're seeing.
Great, thanks very much, Ben. And Ben, just out of interest, in your property in Copenhagen, what proportion of your students are international as opposed to home?
It's, I would look at it probably across the whole Nido portfolio. The demographics within our Copenhagen asset are the most diverse. So internationally led 100%. And I think because so many courses are now delivered in English as well, in the leading institutions, this attracts a wider audience kind of globally for students to come. And we definitely going to see a high percentage of international students. At the moment, it's kind of 35% Germany and 15% Italy. So that's quite interesting in itself. And then, there's maybe 5 to 10% of Danish students. So,
Mixed. Great. Good. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to the next question, which is for Therese and Laurie predominantly here, but Christina, Ben, add in any comments that you want. But this is for those of you new to the class, or those of you that have been class partners for some time, you'll note that Frank and others founded the Class Foundation in 2011 in response to the student living crisis in the Netherlands at the time, and that ecosystem grew and expanded throughout Europe subsequently. That issue of affordability is still around and forms a big part of the crisis across across Europe. And I'd just like to ask from perspective of the university and from Laurie's perspective in his association, there is a suggestion that there's an absence of thinking around creating different housing for different cohorts of students. And it shouldn't be just seen as perhaps this is a lazy reflection that many PBSA markets are building for international students with perhaps some deeper pockets, and they can afford those, and the home students perhaps in different countries are struggling to find more affordable accommodation. What do you think you could do to create a solution that meets the needs of various cohorts, or do you think people are doing that in some instances already?
Okay, I'll start.
Yeah.
So I would say that in Malmö, there are 2 types of student housing that is missing. One is student housing for smaller families, because we can see that there is a lack of that. But there is a dilemma to this, and it's that it easily becomes quite expensive. And it's a fairly small group of students that actually are interested in this, because the majority of students are interested in a studio. But still, there is a lack of this. Also, there's a lack of perhaps really, really small, low-priced student properties or units. But the problem with that is the Swedish building regulations, but also perhaps that this is a product that would be aimed specifically to an international market, and perhaps not to the domestic students, because I don't think that this is a product that they would be interested in. And then I don't really know if this is a lucrative option either way. But generally speaking, and I actually think that when you look at Malmö, for example, that the rents are quite reasonable, and the type of housing is more or less what the students want. It's perhaps not what the students need, because in Sweden you have traditionally built a studio between 25 to 30 square meters, and students easily become quite isolated. But this is sadly what many of them want. And I would say that in Malmö, these units are reasonably priced. I mean, I have examples from 2 of the newest constructions, and the yearly rent is 4,800 euro or 4,500 euros. These projects were built with subsidies, I have to say though, but still, I mean, the rent is including water, electricity, heating, TV license, which is something you need in Sweden. So, I mean, I think that is actually really, really affordable. Yeah, so
Yeah,
I'll leave it at that. And
yeah, thanks. And Laurie.
Yeah, I think kind of the market stratification in the Nordics is quite somewhat more complex. It's not on a single scale from high end to more of an affordable option. It's kind of the question, what is a high end product? And from a global perspective, the products that domestic students tend to look for in the Nordics, it's often the studio, quite a high quality studio for an individual student. It's actually, in a global perspective, it's a very high-end product. But in terms of the services offered in the accommodation, it's quite different from what would be a high-end product in other countries. It's more like homes, normal homes, but for students. So it's more homes than accommodation. But still, I think we are seeing a divergence, quite big divergence based on the educational origin of students. Like domestic students are looking for quite a high-quality product and more homely product, while many of the international students, at least in Finland, we see that they often tend to look for the most affordable option. And both private and non-profit sectors will have a hard time kind of finding a product that meets the price point that students can afford. And I think we're facing that. Therese actually pointed out to kind of a Nordic student housing paradox. We know the students are struggling mentally, and we know that key contributing factors for that is financial issues and loneliness. Yet still we see students, they're going to choose to live privately and choose the more costly options. But I think the key questions are like, how can we meet the studio demand with an affordable product? Then the question of international students, how can we meet their price point but still offer adequate housing? And the new emerging question in this is students arriving with families. We've seen a huge increase in international students arriving with families in Finland. And I think that's a very difficult kind of product and price point to match. And also the question is what is the scale of kind of the high-end international student market? So how many students are looking for the high-end traditional PBSA product with lots of additional services offered? And that's, I think that differs a lot from in different Nordic countries, and changes in educational policy might shift that entirely very quickly, and based on whereabouts in the world are the international student cohorts coming from.
Good. Laurie, that's great. Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time here, so I'm going to quickly move on to the third question, which is essentially a response from the private sector back to the comments of Therese and Laurie in terms of their thinking around that. How can the private sector meet the needs under the auspices of trying to manage investors' expectations as well? So thoughts around that. The studio issue is something that's talked about a lot. There is suggestions that a lot of studio accommodation, particularly in some really big civic cities, are exacerbating the issues of loneliness and well-being. So what do you as organisations think you can do to try to alleviate some of those issues?
I can take that one first, if you wish. I mean, first of all, I mean, we have a large scale. I mean, if you look at SIA, we have a large scale. That also means that we can create concepts that we can really apply to all our properties. And right now we are working with a community program called a Base Life, actually really invented by Basecamp initially, where we think not only about service, so it's not only about 24/7 receptions, it's very much about using activity, putting life to the spaces. So it's a lot about the engagement. It's a lot about care, so that we know that students are coming like from China, from somewhere. They don't have any idea of what they will meet in Copenhagen or whatever they land. So we help them. I mean, just to get a doctor or get medical care or have a place to go when they feel lonely. Then we also try to pair them. I mean, because even though we want them to mix, because that's also healthy for the community, but then we also know that it's safe for them to be among others. So we try to create study areas for the Chinese who want more peaceful area, than the Spanish that want like more party. So I mean, we do a lot, and how we work with that and are going to work across entire SIA is that we don't hire full-time employee for these tasks. We actually hire students themselves. We call them base bodies. So we have like 5 to 6 base bodies that might earn, so also a study job, which they like, of course, to earn a little while they are in our countries. It's really, really efficient. And as a private one with some financial muscles, we can scale that and really apply it everywhere and drive it more scientific, so to speak. Then I think if you are a minor one, then at least it's more difficult. So that's one thing. Another thing is that we really look into having different kind of rooms, also making rooms available for more than one student. For example, if we have a room more than 23 square meter, we always add a 140 bed. Then a student can pay only 30 euro, that's our price, to have like a friend living, boyfriend, whatever it is. And that is a super popular one. So immediately it gets much more affordable for the students.
Great. Thanks, Christina. Ben, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think from a NIDO perspective, and before we enter any market, there's a lot of work done by the central function to really kind of analyze the offering. It's not a kind of drag and drop scenario where we just drop our operational model into every city we go into, because that doesn't work. So we're acutely aware of that. We adapt our offering around the different cultures, different challenges that we may face on that way. And then I suppose when we look at the NIDO Briggen asset that we have, and because planning consent allowed it, we looked at operating a co-living platform rather than just purely student. So appealing to, I suppose, a wider audience, and also supporting the kind of a housing option for the wider population in Copenhagen. There's a variety in the offering that we have at NIDO Briggen, so it's not fundamentally just pure studios. We also offer apartments. So if you want to have that space to yourself, you can. If you want to share with a friend, you can also do that too. And then supplement, I suppose, maybe the isolation element of living on your own. We've got a lot of amenity spaces within the development itself, both internally and externally. And we really promote the kind of engagement within the residents. We have an experiential program that delivers events. Similarly to what Christina said, we try and allow our residents to lead on that. What do they want, rather than us giving them something and saying, you should kind of engage with this. It's really fundamentally led by the residents themselves. And when we think about, that element of mental health and loneliness, we do a lot of in-depth surveys throughout the year to really kind of drill into that element and understand what we can do to impact that. So yeah, that's kind of what we're going to try to achieve at NIDO to mitigate that element.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ben. I really appreciate all your comments, panelists. So thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions. The first one is from Thomas Storgard. He says, I have a question regarding affordability in the region. Do the panelists believe it's feasible to provide an affordable product across the region without some level of regulatory intervention? It's a good question. I'm going to go to Laurie, who's got his hand up.
I think because of course there's the differences in the Nordic countries having their housing policy. They're quite big, surprisingly big. Like Denmark, I think, has a rent cap. Sweden has centrally negotiated rent increases, and Finland has a clear division into the non-profit sector and then the private market sector. So it's quite difficult within the region. So to answer kind of a comprehensively to this, because and also the differences between the bigger cities and the like secondary cities or smaller university cities. I'd say in the biggest cities, it's kind of difficult to offer a very affordable product without some kind of a regulation or subsidy intervention. But that those interventions are somewhat already in place, but they're different in different countries. So you'd have to go into different countries and look into their housing policy models and try to kind of figure out if it's possible or not in that particular context.
Okay, good. And another question is around the concept of co-living competing with PBSA. Do you see that happening in your markets, Christina?
Yeah, it's there. I mean, but it's not that different. I mean, co-living is also a housing product with some common functionalities, shared things, and that's really the same that many of the PBSA providers like us are doing now. I don't know if it's a competition. It's another product, maybe for another target group than pure student, maybe more young professional, and also, I mean, people like me who are social and just want to live together with other social individuals.
Thank you very much. Therese?
Well, we can see that there is a boom of co-living operators in Sweden. With that said, I don't really think that the Swedish student quite have grasped the concept of it. I still think that what the Swedish student want is perhaps not what they need, and it's a single studio. And I don't think, not today, that they're really prepared to pay the additional cost that the co-living option means. I think this has to do a lot with the fact that the concept is still quite new. It's not something that your parents really tried. I mean, they might have lived in a dormitory in the 70s, but that was completely different. And, you know, you either loved it or hated it. And then, so I think there needs to be a better introduction of the concept because it's still very unknown.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you all. It's been wonderful. I'm sure we could have gone on for another 2 hours and we'd only then just be sprinkling at the base. So this has been a really good snapshot of the Nordics region. I think from our perspective at the class, we're recognizing more and more that the need for collaboration between public and private organizations is critical. It's moving in slowly in different directions, country to country. It varies an enormous amount, but certainly in the topic of affordability and the different types of accommodation for different cohorts, there's a real need to understand what a university's perspective is, what the municipalities or the city's perspective is, and that will to what's happening in the private sector and investors. And that's what the class aims to do, is to create and continues to create a larger and larger community of people representing the different areas. So for those attendees that are not partners, come and join us, because it really is a good opportunity for you to share information and get your particular perspective across. It's a really well needed process to move forward with. So we are. I just want to highlight 2 sessions that we're having in the next couple of months. On June the 13th in Milan, we are bringing together leaders from universities, the city, municipalities, government, and operators and investors together for a session on framing the future and how they can work better together. And we really would encourage people to either come to Milan or look out on the website, email us if they've got any questions, etc. We're really looking forward to that program, and we're working hard to make sure we've got the right people in the room. Frank Uffin, our founder, and Kellyanne and others within the class are also working with a number of different organisations in taking forward the Dutch National Action Plan on student accommodation to develop 60,000 bedrooms by 2030. And there is another meeting in Rotterdam, a session hosted by the class in July. So please join us. I think there's something just popped up there. That would be great. So thank you so much, panelists. To Laurie, thank you. If there was a ability to clap from everybody, I'm sure there would be. To Les, thank you very much. Ben, thank you. Christina, I'll be in touch with you all, and I'm sure we'll pick up some of those questions that haven't been answered. But thank you so much for everybody attending today. Keep in touch, and yeah, we look forward to hearing from you all soon. Thank you very much. Cheers. Bye-bye.